He thought he had lost what made him a man, but what he had truly lost was something far more dangerous to a man like Adrian Volkov: the ability to feel anything at all. The city of Chicago still whispered his name in low voices, the way people speak about storms they once survived, because Adrian Volkov had built an empire without raising his voice, without second chances, without hesitation. And yet tonight, under the dim glow of a single lamp in his marble-lined study, the man who controlled millions of dollars and countless lives stood completely still in front of a mirror, his reflection staring back at him like a stranger he no longer recognized. His tailored suit hanging perfectly on broad shoulders that once carried absolute certainty, but now felt heavier than steel, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow, his hand resting on the edge of the polished desk, as if he needed something solid to remind himself he was still standing. Because for weeks now, something had been wrong, something no doctor could explain, no amount of money could fix, no loyal associate could even dare to mention out loud. And in the quiet corners of his organization, rumors had begun to spread like cracks through glass, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Whispers that the boss was changing, that the man who once made decisions in seconds now paused too long, that meetings ended without conclusions, that orders lacked the sharp finality they once carried, and no one dared to ask why. Because power, real power, was not something you questioned, it was something you obeyed. And yet even power has a scent when it begins to fade, and men who had built their lives around Adrian's certainty were beginning to notice the silence where his authority used to live. But none of them saw what happened after the doors closed, after the suits were hung, after the guards turned their eyes away, because in those moments, Adrian Volkov was no longer the most feared man in the city. He was just a man standing alone in a room too large, listening to the echo of his own breathing, wondering when exactly everything inside him had gone quiet, when the fire that once drove him had turned into something cold and distant, something unreachable. And he hated that feeling more than any enemy he had ever faced, because enemies could be defeated, controlled, eliminated. But this emptiness offered no target, no strategy, no solution. And for a man like Adrian, that was the most dangerous thing of all, because control had always been his identity, his armor, his proof that he was still the one in charge. And without it, he felt exposed in a way no one could ever see, not his men, not his rivals. Not the city that still bowed to his name, and certainly not the quiet figure moving silently through the hallway outside his study at that very moment. A woman no one paid attention to. A new maid whose footsteps barely made a sound against the polished floors, her presence unnoticed, her eyes observant, her world existing in the spaces between power and invisibility. And as she passed the half-open door, she didn't mean to look inside, didn't mean to witness anything at all, but something about the stillness of the man inside that room made her pause for just a second longer than she should have, long enough to see what no one else ever saw. And in that brief moment, without saying a word, without stepping inside, Lena Carter became the only person in that house who understood one simple truth, that the most powerful man in the city was breaking in complete silence. The next morning, the mansion moved exactly as it always had, polished floors reflecting the soft morning light, staff members gliding through hallways with practiced precision, voices low, footsteps measured, because in a house like this, silence was not just expected, it was required. And yet something subtle had shifted, something that could not be named but could be felt in the way conversations stopped a second too early, in the way the guards at the front entrance avoided eye contact longer than usual, in the way the senior housekeeper checked her watch twice as often, because everyone sensed it even if no one dared to say it. The center of gravity in this house was no longer as steady as it once was, and at precisely 8 o'clock, Adrian Volkov stepped into the main dining room, his presence still commanding enough to straighten spines and lower gazes, his dark suit immaculate, his expression controlled. But there was a fraction of a pause before he took his seat, a hesitation so small it would have been invisible to anyone who had not been watching closely. And Lena Carter, standing near the far wall with a tray balanced in her steady hands, noticed it immediately, because once you had seen a crack, no matter how thin, you could not unsee it, and she had seen something the night before that did not belong in a man like him. something quiet and human and dangerously unguarded. And now, as she watched him sit at the head of a long table designed to remind everyone exactly who he was, she realized that the silence around him was not the silence of control, it was the silence of uncertainty. And across the table, one of his senior associates cleared his throat, carefully, respectfully, before placing a folder in front of Adrian, the kind of movement that used to trigger immediate attention, immediate decisions, immediate authority. But today, Adrian did not reach for it right away, his eyes resting on the folder for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing something invisible, and the room held its breath without realizing it. Because this was not how it used to be, this was not how he used to move. And when he finally opened the folder, his expression did not change, his voice did not falter. But there was a difference in the space between his words, a slight delay, a softness where there used to be steel, and Lena felt it again. That same quiet recognition settling deeper in her chest, because she had spent her entire life reading rooms where she did not belong, learning how to survive by noticing what others ignored. And what she saw now was not weakness in the way these men feared. It was something more complicated, something heavier, something that did not disappear just because someone put on a suit and sat at the head of a table. And when the meeting ended and chairs shifted and voices returned to their careful tones, Adrian stood without looking at anyone, dismissing them with a single nod. And as the room emptied, he remained there for a moment, alone again in a space built to magnify his authority. And then he turned, his gaze sweeping across the room briefly before landing, unexpectedly, on Lena. And for a fraction of a second, time slowed, because this was the first time he had truly looked at her, not as part of the background, not as another invisible presence, but as someone standing there, watching, understanding more than she should. And his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not in suspicion, but in something quieter, something searching, as if he was trying to place a feeling he had not allowed himself to acknowledge. And Lena did not look away, her posture still, her expression calm, because she was not afraid of him in the way others were, not after what she had seen. And that moment, brief and silent, stretched just long enough to shift something neither of them fully understood, before Adrian turned away without a word and walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, heavier, more aware. And Lena stood there for a second longer, her grip steady on the tray, her mind already turning, because she knew now with absolute certainty that whatever was happening to Adrian Volkov was not something that power alone could fix. And for the first time since she had arrived in this house, she was no longer just passing through it unnoticed, she was part of something that was beginning to change. By late afternoon, the mansion had returned to its usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, something fragile lingered in the air like a note that had not fully faded. And Lena Carter felt it with every step she took down the long corridor leading toward the west wing, where sunlight filtered through tall windows and stretched across the marble floors in quiet gold patterns, the kind of beauty that often distracted others, but never her. Because Lena had learned long ago that survival did not come from admiring a place. It came from understanding it, from noticing the details people ignored, from reading the silences between movements. And today those silences were louder than anything spoken, especially after what had happened in the dining room, especially after the way Adrian Volkov had looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, as if something about her presence had unsettled a part of him he had been trying to keep buried. And that look stayed with her as she entered his study hours later, assigned a routine task that should have been no different from any other: dusting the shelves, straightening the edges of documents, restoring order to a space that demanded perfection. And yet the moment she stepped inside, she felt it again, that same quiet weight that hung in the air the night before, the kind of stillness that did not come from peace, but from something held too tightly for too long. And the room itself seemed to carry it: the dark wood, the heavy curtains, the faint scent of polished leather, and something colder beneath it, something unspoken. And Lena moved carefully, her hands steady, her movements precise, but her awareness heightened, because she knew this was not just a room. This was where he came when no one was watching, where the man behind the power stood alone. And as she reached the desk, her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second over the smooth surface, remembering the way he had gripped it the night before, the tension in his hand, The way his reflection had looked like someone fighting something invisible, and she did not need to imagine what that felt like, because she had seen that look before in other places, in other people, in quieter lives far removed from marble floors and tailored suits, and it always meant the same thing. Something inside had broken in a way no one else could see, and just as she resumed her work, the sound of the door opening behind her cut through the silence, soft but unmistakable, and Lena turned slowly, her expression calm, her posture straight, because in this house, being caught in the wrong place could mean everything, and Adrian Volkov stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space without effort, his gaze fixed on her in a way that made the room feel smaller, more focused, as if the distance between them had suddenly become the only thing that mattered. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this was not supposed to happen. He was not supposed to return while she was there. She was not supposed to be seen in this space where he kept the parts of himself no one else was allowed to witness. And yet here they were, standing in the same room, in the same silence. And Adrian took a step forward, slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers, not with anger, not with suspicion, but with something harder to define, something that searched for answers without knowing the question. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, quieter, as if the walls themselves might be listening, asking a question that carried more weight than the words alone. What did you see? And Lena did not look away, did not rush to deny or explain, because she understood something he did not expect her to understand, that sometimes the truth was not in what you said, but in what you allowed to remain unhidden. And so she answered simply, her voice steady, respectful but unafraid. I saw someone who is tired of carrying something alone. And the room went still in a way that felt different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but charged with a quiet honesty that neither of them could take back. And Adrian did not respond right away, his expression unreadable, his posture unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted, something small but undeniable, as if for the first time in a long time, someone had spoken to him without fear, without expectation, without seeing the title before the man, and that moment, fragile and unguarded, settled between them like something that could either break or begin. Adrian did not move, not immediately, and in that stillness the weight of Lena's words seemed to settle deeper into the room, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as something far more dangerous to a man like him, something honest, and honesty had never been a tool he trusted, because honesty stripped away control, and control was the only thing that had ever made sense in his world. Yet now, standing a few feet away from a woman who had no power in this house and no reason to speak, without fear, he found himself without the immediate response he was used to, his mind not reaching for commands or conclusions, but instead circling something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable. And when he finally exhaled, the sound was quieter than he expected, almost unsteady in a way no one else would have recognized. But Lena noticed, because she was not watching for power, she was watching for truth, and Adrian's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if the question he had asked her had turned back on himself, forcing him to confront something he had avoided for far too long. And for a moment, the room felt smaller, not because of its size, but because of the silence pressing in from every direction. And when he spoke again, his voice carried less authority and more weight, not directed at her, but somewhere between them, as if he was testing the shape of his own thoughts for the first time. People like you should not be in rooms like this. And it could have sounded like a dismissal, like a reminder of her place. But the tone did not match the words, because there was no edge to it, no threat, only a quiet confusion. And Lena understood that immediately, her expression unchanged, her posture still respectful but grounded, because she had heard those kinds of words her entire life, spoken with judgment, with distance, with certainty. But this was different. This was not about her. This was about him trying to understand why she had not reacted the way everyone else did, why she had not looked away, why she had not lowered herself to fit the invisible lines that defined this house. And she answered with the same calm clarity that had unsettled him before. Maybe people like me are the only ones who should be. And the words did not rise, did not challenge. They simply existed, steady and quiet. And Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something he could not easily dismiss, because she was not wrong, not in the way that mattered. And that realization created a brief, fragile tension that neither of them broke until Adrian turned away, not abruptly, not dismissively, but slowly, as if he needed the space to think without her eyes on him. And he moved toward the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, the city, stretching out beyond it, a place that still bent to his will, still moved at his command, and yet standing there, he felt none of that certainty, only the echo of her words repeating quietly in his mind. And Lena did not leave, did not rush to escape the moment, because she understood something he did not yet fully grasp, that walking away too quickly would turn this back into something it was not supposed to be. And so she remained where she was, giving him space without abandoning the presence that had already begun to change the air between them. And after a long moment, Adrian spoke again, not turning around, his voice lower, more measured, as if each word required more effort than it should have. Do you think it is weakness? And the question hung there, simple on the surface but carrying something much deeper underneath. And Lena did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she knew this was not a question about power or reputation or anything the outside world would recognize. This was about something internal, something fragile. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer but just as steady. No, I think it is what happens when someone has been strong for too long without anyone asking if they are okay. And this time, Adrian did not move at all, not even slightly, because that answer did not challenge him, it did not threaten him. It simply reached a place he had kept closed for years, and for the first time since the silence inside him had begun. He did not try to push it away. He just stood there, listening, and the room, once defined by control and distance, shifted into something else entirely, something quieter, something real. And in that moment, without anyone else knowing, without any announcement or command, something inside Adrian Volkov began to change. The silence did not break when Lena finished speaking. It deepened, settling into the corners of the room like something that had finally found a place to rest. And Adrian remained by the window, his reflection faint against the glass, but no longer distant in the way it had been before, because for the first time in years, the thoughts inside his mind were not racing toward control or calculation. They were simply there, unguarded, and that unfamiliar stillness made him feel exposed in a way no threat ever had, because threats were external, predictable, something you could prepare for, but this was internal, quiet, and impossible to command. And he realized with a clarity that unsettled him that he had spent years building walls so high that even he could not see over them anymore. And now, standing in a room that had always belonged to him, he felt like a visitor inside his own life. And behind him, Lena remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but could not be ignored. And that was what made it different, because everyone else in this house moved around him with purpose tied to his authority, but she did not. She simply existed, and that quiet difference shifted something he had not expected, because for the first time, he was not being observed for what he controlled, but for what he carried. And slowly, almost reluctantly, Adrian turned away from the window, his gaze returning to her, not sharp, not guarded, but searching, as if he was trying to understand why her words had reached a place nothing else had. And when he spoke, his voice carried less distance than before, not familiar, but closer to something human. How do you see it? And it was not a command, not even a challenge. It was a question that did not belong to the man who had built his life on certainty. And Lena did not rush to answer, not because she hesitated, but because she understood that this moment was not about giving him something quick or easy. It was about meeting him where he stood. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded, shaped by a life that had taught her how to carry weight without letting it define her. I see someone who forgot that being strong does not mean being alone. And the words did not echo loudly. They did not need to, because they settled exactly where they needed to, and Adrian felt it, not as a realization that arrived suddenly, but as something that had been waiting quietly beneath everything else, something he had avoided by filling every space with control, with decisions, with movement, because stopping meant feeling, and feeling had never been part of the role he had built for himself. And yet now, standing here, he could not ignore it. And for the first time, he did not try to, and the tension that had defined his posture since she entered the room eased just slightly, barely noticeable, but real, and Lena saw it, not as a victory, not as a change she had caused, but as something he had allowed, and that mattered more, because no one could force this kind of shift. It had to come from within, and Adrian's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, not measuring, not judging, but acknowledging, and without another word, he stepped aside, not as a dismissal, but as an unspoken permission for her to continue what she had been doing, and Lena understood, her movements resuming with the same quiet precision. But the room was no longer the same, the air no longer heavy in the way it had been before, because something had been said that could not be taken back, something that had shifted the balance in a way no one else would notice. And as the minutes passed, neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was steady, grounded in something new, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both could feel. And when Lena finally moved toward the door, her task complete, she paused for just a second, not to look back, not to say anything more, but because she knew that moments like this did not happen often, and when they did, they mattered in ways that could not be measured, and Adrian remained where he was, watching her leave, not as someone insignificant, not as part of the background, but as the person who had seen him clearly when he could not see himself. And for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed her departure did not feel like something he needed to escape. It felt like something he could finally sit with, without losing himself inside it. That evening, the mansion seemed quieter than usual, not because fewer people moved through its halls, but because something unspoken had begun to shift beneath the surface. And Adrian Volkov felt it the moment he stepped back into his study, the room no longer pressing in on him the way it had before, the air still carrying its familiar weight, but no longer suffocating, and he paused just inside the doorway, his hand resting lightly against the frame, as if he needed a moment to understand why everything felt slightly different without anything actually changing. The desk was where it always was, the chair perfectly aligned, the city lights beginning to flicker on beyond the window, yet there was a quiet absence of something that had once filled every inch of this space, the constant tension he had carried without realizing it. And as he walked further in, his steps slower than usual, more deliberate, he noticed the small details that had been overlooked for years, the faint reflection of light across the polished wood, the subtle scent of the room no longer sharp, but almost neutral. And he understood then that nothing in this room had changed except him, or rather, the way he was beginning to allow himself to be present within it. And that realization did not come with clarity or comfort, it came with uncertainty, because for a man who had built his entire identity on control, the idea of simply existing without forcing direction felt dangerously unfamiliar, and yet he did not turn away from it. He did not reach for distraction or command. Instead, he moved toward the chair behind his desk and sat down slowly, not with authority, but with intention, his hands resting on the surface in front of him, not gripping, not holding on, just there, and the silence that followed was different now. It did not echo, it did not demand to be filled, it simply stayed, steady and present, and for the first time in a long time, Adrian allowed himself to sit within it without trying to reshape it. And as minutes passed, he found his thoughts drifting, not toward business, not toward strategy, but toward something far less structured, fragments of memory he had not revisited in years, moments before everything became defined by responsibility and expectation, before every decision carried weight that could not be shared. And he realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped allowing himself to feel anything that did not serve a purpose, and that absence had not made him stronger. It had made him empty in ways he could no longer ignore, and the quiet truth of that settled in slowly, not as a burden, but as something he could finally acknowledge. And just as that realization began to take shape, a soft knock sounded at the door, breaking the stillness without disrupting it. And Adrian looked up, his gaze steady, not guarded, just aware. And after a brief pause, the door opened slightly, revealing Lena standing just beyond the threshold, her posture respectful, her expression calm, and she did not step inside immediately, did not assume permission, but there was no hesitation in her presence either, because something between them had already shifted, something that did not rely on titles or distance, and Adrian held her gaze for a moment, longer than necessary, as if measuring something he could not quite define before. Speaking in a tone that carried neither command nor dismissal, just quiet acknowledgement. "You can come in," and the words felt different in the room, lighter, less rigid, and Lena stepped forward with the same quiet confidence she had carried before, not intrusive, not hesitant, simply present, and she placed a glass of water on the edge of the desk without a word, a small, ordinary action that carried no expectation and demanded no response. And yet Adrian noticed it in a way he would not have before, because it was not about the water, it was about the intention behind it, simple, unforced, human, and he looked at the glass for a moment, then back at her, and something in his expression softened, not visibly enough for anyone else to comment, but enough for the space between them to feel different, and Lena did not speak, did not explain, because she understood that not everything needed words, and as she turned to leave, her movements as quiet as ever, Adrian reached for the glass, his hand steady, and took a slow sip, not out of habit, but out of awareness, and the room remained silent, but no longer empty, and for the first time in a long time, the most powerful man in the city was not trying to fill the silence. He was learning how to exist within it, and that, more than anything else, marked the beginning of something he had never allowed himself before. The next day did not arrive with any grand announcement or visible shift in the rhythm of the house. But for Adrian Volkov, something had already changed in a way that could not be reversed, and it revealed itself not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet details that had once gone unnoticed, the way he paused before speaking, the way he listened longer than necessary, the way his gaze no longer moved past people as if they were part of the architecture, and in the main conference room, where polished wood and controlled voices had always defined the space. His presence carried a different kind of weight, not less powerful, but less distant, and as his associates gathered around the table, exchanging subtle glances when they thought he was not looking, the tension in the room was no longer just about business. It was about uncertainty, because power that changed without explanation was something no one knew how to navigate, and Adrian could feel it, not as a threat, but as awareness that settled quietly in the back of his mind. And when the first report was presented, he did not interrupt, did not cut through the details with immediate conclusions. Instead, he listened, his hands resting loosely on the table, his posture steady but no longer rigid, and the silence that followed each statement stretched just a little longer than before, enough to make people shift in their seats, enough to remind them that something was different. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same depth it always had, but without the sharp edge that once defined it, and the words that followed were measured, clear, but not rushed, as if he was allowing himself the space to think rather than forcing immediate control. And that difference did not go unnoticed, not by the men around him, and not by the quiet presence standing near the doorway, unseen by most, but fully aware of everything unfolding, because Lena Carter had learned exactly where to stand to observe, without being acknowledged, and from that place, she watched not the decisions being made, but the man making them, and she saw it again, that subtle shift in the way he carried himself, the absence of that constant internal tension that had once defined every movement, and in its place, something steadier, something more grounded, not weaker, but more real. And when one of the senior associates hesitated mid-sentence, clearly unsure how to proceed without the familiar cues Adrian used to give, the room fell into a brief, uncertain silence. And it was in that moment that Adrian did something no one expected. He did not fill the silence immediately. He allowed it to exist, and then, calmly, he spoke. "Take your time, finish what you were saying," and the words landed differently than any command ever had, because they were not about authority, they were about presence, and the man across the table nodded quickly, almost relieved, continuing his explanation with renewed clarity, and around the room, the shift was felt, subtle, but undeniable, as if something rigid had been loosened without breaking, and Lena saw it all, the way the space responded to him, the way the energy changed without force, and she understood something that the others did not, that this was not a loss of power, this was a different kind of strength emerging, one that did not rely on pressure or control. And when the meeting finally ended, the chairs moved back, voices returned to their usual tones, But there was an undercurrent of something new, something uncertain yet not unwelcome, and Adrian stood, his gaze briefly sweeping the room before it paused, just for a second, on the doorway where Lena stood, and though no words were exchanged, there was a quiet acknowledgement in that glance, something shared without being spoken, and then he turned and walked out, his steps steady, not rushed, not heavy, just grounded, and Lena remained where she was for a moment longer, her eyes following him not with curiosity, but with quiet understanding, because she knew that what had begun in silence was now starting to shape the world around him, not through force, but through something far more powerful, something that could not be commanded, only chosen. And as the room emptied and the echoes of conversation faded, the space itself felt different, not louder, not brighter, but more alive, as if it had been waiting for this change long before anyone realized it was needed. That evening, the mansion did not feel like a place built on control anymore, at least not entirely, because something quieter had begun to weave itself through the structure, something that could not be commanded or enforced, and Adrian Volkov noticed it in the way people moved around him, not with less respect, but with less fear, subtle changes that would have once gone ignored, but now stood out in ways he could not dismiss. And as he walked through the main hallway, his steps measured and steady, he caught fragments of conversation that stopped not out of panic, but out of habit, and for the first time, he did not expect silence to follow him like a shadow. He simply walked, aware of the space, aware of himself within it. And when he entered the smaller sitting room adjacent to his study, a place he rarely used, he paused, his eyes taking in the soft lighting, the untouched arrangement of chairs, the stillness that felt different from the rest of the house, and he moved inside. Without thinking, choosing to sit not behind a desk, not at the head of anything, but in a chair by the window, something he had never done before, and the act itself felt unfamiliar, almost unnecessary, yet grounding in a way he could not explain, and for a few moments, he did nothing, no plans, no decisions, just sat there, his gaze resting on the fading light outside, and in that quiet, something else surfaced, not a memory exactly, but a realization that had been forming slowly, that power, without presence, had left him disconnected not only from others, but from himself, and that thought lingered just long enough to matter before a soft sound at the doorway shifted his attention, and Lena Carter stood there, not hesitant, not intrusive, simply present as she had always been, and Adrian looked at her, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if her presence now belonged in these quieter moments as much as his own, and she stepped in without waiting for instruction, carrying nothing this time, offering nothing physical, only the same calm steadiness that had begun to reshape the space around him. And she did not speak immediately, because she understood that silence was no longer something he feared, and Adrian watched her for a moment, then gestured slightly toward the chair across from him. Not a command, not even a request, just an opening. And Lena accepted it without hesitation, sitting across from him with the same composed posture, her presence neither above nor below, simply equal in the moment. And the room settled into a stillness that did not need to be filled. And after a few seconds, Adrian spoke, his voice quieter than it had ever been in this house. Not because it lacked strength, but because it no longer needed to prove it. I do not remember the last time I sat like this, and the admission hung there, simple, but carrying years behind it. And Lena met his gaze without judgment, without surprise, just understanding. Because she knew that people did not forget moments like that by accident. They left them behind in order to survive something else. And she answered gently, "Sometimes you forget because you were trying to hold everything else together." And Adrian nodded slightly, the motion small but deliberate. And for the first time, there was no resistance in him, no need to defend the life he had built or the choices that had brought him here. Only a quiet acceptance that something had been missing, and that missing piece was not power, not control, but something far more human, something that could not be forced or demanded. And as the silence returned, it no longer felt like distance, it felt like space, space to breathe, to think, to exist without pressure. And Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders less burdened, and across from him, Lena remained steady, her presence unchanged, but now fully seen. And in that moment, nothing dramatic happened. No declarations, no sudden transformations, just two people sitting in a quiet room. One who had carried too much for too long, and one who understood how to exist without needing to carry anything at all. And somehow, that simple balance was enough to shift everything that mattered. The days that followed did not announce themselves as a turning point, and yet everything within the walls of the mansion carried a quiet sense that something fundamental had shifted, not in structure, not in power, but in presence, and Adrian Volkov moved through his world with the same authority he had always held, but without the distance that once separated him from everything around him. And those who worked under him could not explain it. They only felt it in the way their own voices know. Longer tightened when he entered a room, in the way conversations continued instead of collapsing into silence, in the way decisions were now met with clarity instead of tension, because his strength had not diminished, it had changed shape, and Lena Carter saw it more clearly than anyone, not because she was looking for it, but because she had always known what it looked like when someone stopped hiding from themselves. And one late afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the floors in long, quiet lines, Adrian stood once again in his study. But this time he was not alone in the way he used to be, even though no one else was physically there, because the silence no longer pressed against him. It moved with him, steady and calm, and he walked to the mirror without hesitation, his reflection meeting him without resistance. And for the first time in a long time, he did not search for something missing. He simply looked, taking in the man he had become, not perfect, not invulnerable, but present, and that was enough. And a soft knock sounded at the door, familiar now, and when Lena stepped inside, she did not need to ask why she had been called, because something in the air already carried the answer, and Adrian turned toward her, his expression composed but no longer guarded. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this was not a moment that required explanation, it required acknowledgement. And Adrian stepped aside slightly, not out of habit, but out of choice, creating space in a room that had once been defined by control, and Lena remained where she was, her posture steady, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. And in that quiet exchange, everything that had passed between them existed without needing to be repeated. And Adrian finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, but carrying something deeper than authority, something grounded in understanding. "You were right." And the words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had come to realize, not as a confession, not as a surrender, but as recognition. And Lena did not respond with surprise or validation. She simply held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, because she had never needed to prove anything. She had only needed him to see it for himself. And the room fell into silence once more, but this time it was complete, not empty, not searching, just whole. And outside, the city continued to move, unaware of what had changed within these walls, unaware that the man who once ruled through distance had found something far more enduring, something that could not be taken or challenged. Because it was not built on fear or control, it was built on presence. And as Lena turned to leave, her steps as quiet as ever, Adrian remained where he was, not watching her go as someone above or below him, but as someone who had walked into his life without power and left behind something far more valuable than anything he had ever commanded. And when the door closed softly behind her, the room did not return to what it had been before. It remained exactly as it was now, steady, grounded, and real. And Adrian stood there for a moment longer, his reflection no longer a stranger, his silence no longer an enemy. And without needing to say it out loud, without needing anyone else to witness it, he understood something that had taken him years to reach. That strength was never about what you could control. It was about what you could face without turning away. And that day, without noise, without spectacle, the most powerful man in the city finally understood what it meant to be whole.